Thank you. So if you can introduce yourself as well.
Good afternoon to you all. My name is Babette Resurrection. I'm a full-time faculty at the Gender and Development Studies Department of the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand. Don't know if any of you are familiar with the AIT. It actually began as an engineering technological institute, but today, since 1997, we have a degree awarding department called Gender and Development Studies. We confer postgraduate degrees in gender and development. So anyone interested to pursue that, please let me know. One of our core expertise is really gender and environment issues, doing both teaching and research in this area. So recently, myself, together with a team, put together a regional Southeast Asian research on climate change adaptation. Strictly speaking, it was not a gender-focused research, but certainly gender was mainstreamed into this effort. The research, just a bit of background, was actually upon the commission of DFID, the Department for International Development of the British government, and IDRC, International Development Research Center of Canada, because they will be soon coming out with a research program on climate change adaptation in Asia. We at AIT did the Southeast Asian report. So what I want to share with you this afternoon would be some of the salient points of this research. Also, the objective of this research is to precisely inform the new program on climate change adaptation of both DFID and the IDRC. Next slide, please. So this is the product, the research itself that came out of this effort. Just to share with you the process that went with it, the whole intent was to see the gaps with respect to climate change adaptation in Southeast Asia. Asking the question, what are people doing with respect to planned and autonomous adaptation? So two kinds of adaptation we're focusing here. Planned adaptation, perhaps which many governments are concerned with, and autonomous adaptation. And the second question we asked ourselves is, what are the major gaps? What are the major knowledge gaps with regards to climate change adaptation? And for this, to answer these questions, we interviewed, we had 76 interviews throughout the region, of course, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, in the Philippines, Vietnam, as well as Laos PDR. We also held 3 roundtable consultations throughout the region. First one was in Vietnam, in Hanoi. The second one was here in Manila, held in De La Salle University. And the last regional one was held at the AIT in Bangkok. We also did an extensive literature review, as well as we also were part of a wider team that did work on China. So there is a China report as well as a South Asia report. Next, please. So what have been the initiatives in climate change in the region, climate change adaptation? We actually employed a particular framework. How do we detect where people are most affected by climate change-related impacts? So we employed the whole framework of vulnerable people in vulnerable places. And in Southeast Asia, we clustered them under 3 categories. The first category being, sorry about this, is just general characteristics of climate change in Southeast Asia, many of which you already know: sea level rise. I don't think I need to go through that because we have limited time. So please, next slide. So one cluster was actually the Mekong Basin, where you have floodplains, deltas, as well as basins. People living with floods, people living with already longer dry spells, as well as also recognizing that 55 million people live in this region. There is also the phenomenon of development with respect to hydropower. The question being, will hydropower development actually improve or exacerbate existing conditions in the Mekong region? Also, climate changes can potentially exacerbate the lives of the majority, of the very poor majority, who most of them rely on agriculture as well as the existing wetlands in this region. Next slide. The second cluster of vulnerable people in vulnerable places would be the coastal and deltaic low-lying areas. So this would include parts of Vietnam, parts of the Philippines, western and eastern seaboards, and the low-lying areas in Indonesia. 42 million people, for instance, in Indonesia live less than 10 meters above the average sea level. There are huge migrant populations, especially in fragile coastal areas, many of which we refer to as peri-urban areas. And of course, in the Mekong Delta, as we know in Vietnam, these are flood-prone areas, although people have adapted largely to floods. We have the phenomenon of people living with floods. However, human-made as well as climate-related changes may precisely dislocate people who are living with floods by way of excessive flooding. So flood-prone deltaic areas used for multiple livelihoods and multiple water users that lead to increasingly saline environments. Please. The third cluster would be the coastal and upland areas of eastern Philippines and Vietnam. These are rural, low-lying, volcanic areas such as Albay in the Philippines, where you have a lot of cyclones and storm surges